Thank you for joining and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, or SOGIESC, study related to the Safeguards Policy Statement by the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or the SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji. I'm your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 16th thematic consultation topic so far, and this is the final in a series of 3 regional consultations and discussions on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. In today's consultation, we are joined by Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department in the ADB, and also by Oliver Chapman, Senior Social Development Specialist, and Tony Jo Lebos, a Senior Consultant on SOGIESC, working directly with the ADB, and Oliver Chapman. We also have on hand a number of other specialists within the ADB. Our moderator for the Q&A session is Heidi Eerd-Dupuy, Head of the NGO and Civil Society Center, again within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB. Other experts will also be on hand for the Q&A session from the same department at the ADB, and I know they all look forward to engaging with you for the discussion as well as responding to feedback. This is our final interactive consultation on the issue of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics, and it builds on the previous sessions on gender and SEA, or sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment that we had last week. Today, we have broad representation, mostly from North America, Europe, including the United Kingdom, as well as small representations from elsewhere in Asia and the Pacific. It's quite a small group today, which means that hopefully we will be able to spend longer and get into more in-depth discussions on some of the topics that will be presented. A note that we will be extensive in our use of SOGIESC as an acronym in English for sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. And you may also hear speakers as well as stakeholders use the term SEA, which denotes sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. We ask that participants take particular note of these acronyms as they may be used extensively throughout this consultation. For this consultation, Oliver Chapman and Tony Jo Lebos will jointly present the main summary issues related to the study they have prepared on SOGIESC and the relationship of this study to gender and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment that was presented last week and gender that was presented the week before. All of these 3 subject areas, of course, are interrelated, and they all pertain to the Safeguards Policy Update, so we look forward to an animated discussion on the issue. From the presentations, we're hoping that participants like yourselves will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy, and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming policy. Comments received from this consultation will inform the revision of ADB's Safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented when joining, ADB is recording this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly to all members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address posted in the chat box. A reminder to please join from a quiet, distraction-free area with your microphone off when you're not speaking. When invited to do so, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand virtually. You will then be asked by Heidi Eerd-Dupuy to unmute yourself and turn on your camera so that you can ask your question live. We're all colleagues here, but we may have different points of view, so please, just a gentle reminder to be respectful to everyone. We will manage time to keep within our schedule. IT support will be provided throughout this consultation, and you may ask for such support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in English, which is the only language we're using today. As we're joining from Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using important buttons. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. On the right-hand side of your screen, look for your own name. Click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name, and then click on the Rename button. Then you can type in your name, the agency you represent, and if you wish, the preferred gender pronoun that you would like to be known by. You can then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or feedback, click on the chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon or the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and then click on the raise hand emoji. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon. To show your video, click on the video icon. The next slides, or set of slides, shows how we value diverse and informed feedback from our wide range of stakeholders. And I'm not going to read every word on the slide, so please feel free to do so yourself. But let me remind you and refer you to the slides on ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations, with another reminder that these sessions are being recorded and documented and will subsequently be distributed during and for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording and distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address at the bottom of the screen or the slide. If you have any issues or concerns on the recording, confidentiality, or the potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat once again through the email address that's on the slide or in the chat box. In this consultation, we have around 2 hours, and here's what we have planned to maximize both our time as well as yours. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide welcome remarks and provide a context for this sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristic study. Mr. Dunn is a Director of Safeguards in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. His presentation will be followed by Oliver Chapman's presentation, who will provide an overview of how specifically the SOGIESC issues relate to the gender work and the SEA work that was presented previously, and the policy imperatives being implemented by the ADB. This will frame the discussion on SOGIESC specifically and allow us to engage on issues of how SOGIESC, as well as the previously discussed SEA and gender issues, can be considered in the Safeguards Policy Update. Oliver is likely known to many of you and is a Senior Social Development Specialist within the ADB. Thirdly, we will follow on from Oliver's presentation with a presentation by Tony Jo Lebos, a Senior Consultant on SOGIESC working directly with the ADB, who will detail some of the SOGIESC study findings and key issues, including a comparator analysis and some of the performance standards and requirements, and how these relate specifically to the revision of the current safeguards policy and might be considered in the revised update. After the presentations by Bruce, Oliver, and Tony, we will take a brief 5-minute break where I will ask you to think about some feedback on the presentations and these consultations in general, offering some advice and feedback on how the consultations and our engagement with you might be improved. Finally, when we return from the break, and as a culmination of the previous presentations, we will have an open discussion on the sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics issues raised in the presentations, as well as by the study summary paper, which has been emailed to all pre-registered participants and continues to be available as a download from the various ADB websites, including the Safeguard Policy Update website. This will be facilitated and moderated, as I mentioned, by Heidi Eyre-Dupuis, who is the head of the NGO and Civil Society Center within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. A reminder that you may ask your questions in the chat box or through raising your hand as previously explained using the Zoom functions. And a further reminder that Heidi will prompt us with guide questions that will be flashed on the screen to frame the conversations and discussions that we will have. Please then join us for a quick series of event evaluations before we turn you over back to Bruce Dunn of the ADB to give us a wrap up and indicative next steps following this consultation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Director Mr. Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks and contextual overview of the SOGIESC study. Bruce, over to you, sir.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Azim. Hi, good day, welcome, and thank you so much to everyone for joining this regional consultation session on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual characteristics, SOGIESC. As Azim has said, this session is part of the update of ADB's safeguard policy, and it's actually part of a series of consultations that we've been doing over the last few weeks on gender and safeguards. And really pleased to be here with many of you tonight. I see that got quite a diverse group, relatively small, but I know that a number of you have joined these consultation sessions before. Looking at the participants list, I see many colleagues that we've been fortunate to connect with in earlier sessions, but also quite a number of new groups represented here today. Many of you are focused on SOGIESC issues. Many of you are working on LGBTQ inclusion issues or wider issues in relation to human rights and development. Wherever you come from, though, I'm very happy to have you here in this consultation session. And we're very much looking forward to sharing views today and hearing your thoughts and recommendations. As we do have a number of people that are joining, though, these consultation sessions for the first time, let me just provide a bit of brief background into why we're here from the ADB side before talking a little bit about the subject matter for today. Firstly, ADB is in the process of updating our 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement. And this is quite fundamental policy for ADB. It aims to ensure that the projects that ADB supports or finances don't lead to any adverse impacts on the environment or people. And the key objectives of the policy are to avoid, minimize, or mitigate, sometimes to offset the impacts of projects on people and the environment, while at the same time also building capacity of our developing member countries and clients to implement the safeguards. The policy, of course, now is more than a decade old, and the ADB had commissioned a study by our independent evaluation department to look at the effectiveness of the existing safeguards. And that study was concluded in May 2020. The evaluation had 5 key recommendations, and I won't go into the details, but I just want to highlight a couple of the key ones. The first and I think most fundamental was that it was time for ADB to update and modernize the policy. We need to provide more clarity on some of the key safeguard provisions, while also addressing some of the key gaps in the policy. As many of you know, the international community and others in multilateral financial institutions have evolved their environmental and social safeguards. Many have been updated in the last few years, and there's quite a number of issues that ADB needs to address to either bring us in line with those standards or to look at emerging issues and where we need to strengthen further. So this is really a key area for us to work on. We also need to see how we can strengthen the implementation of the policy, including how we work with countries. And apart from developing the policy itself, another key recommendation was that ADB needed to support the policy provisions with a lot of additional guidance. And that's something that we're already working on for our existing safeguards, but we expect to have a much more comprehensive approach with the new policy. Over the next few years, we'll be rolling out a series of guidance notes that will support implementation. So these are some of the key recommendations, and ADB management actually endorsed all of the recommendations, and then we launched the policy update process. We're intending to complete that over about a 2.5-year period. At this stage, we're looking to have a draft policy available by about September or October this year. We'll be making that publicly available, and then we'll go into further consultations. We're aiming to have the new policy approved by the ADB's board next year. March 2023 was set as the tentative date, but we may extend that if we need additional time. Now, as part of the preparation process, we've been undertaking a range of background and analytical studies. We've been doing some benchmarking with our own policy against that of other multilateral financial institutions. And we've also been looking at implementation experience. And we're feeding those background studies, just short framing studies, into these consultations, and then really looking for feedback from a range of stakeholders, primarily our developing member countries, as well as civil society and a range of other non-government organizations and international organizations. The feedback from the consultations will inform the policy development itself. And as we've been completing these sessions, we're having further deliberations internally in ADB, and then starting to frame up what the policy will look like. Now, coming to the topic today, SOGIESC is a very important issue. It's one that there has been emerging discussions and work on over the last couple of years at ADB. And we're very much looking forward to engaging with many of you today from civil society to help inform us with the way forward. We're very much aware that there is still a lot of stigma, discrimination, and violence, and these are real risks for sexual and gender minorities, and that these issues have distinct effects on them that we need to consider in terms of our safeguards, as well as the proactive agenda that ADB has. We need to work to look at how we integrate the risks to, or the risks facing LGBTQI people into the safeguards, and to ensure that projects do no harm to this community. We're very pleased that there's a lot of emerging good practice that's been developed through other multilateral financial institutions, and of course from your own research and practice. And that's something that we're looking to learn from and build upon. There's also growing collaboration between civil society and many multilateral financial institutions. And this can no doubt provide a very supportive environment for us to be able to explore these issues and look at an appropriate way forward for us. Now, this is just some brief context and background perspective from the ADB, but we've now got 2 brief presentations that my colleagues will provide to give a bit of a further introduction to some of the work that ADB has been doing in the region, and some of the thinking that we've been putting into the approach and the policy framework, including the benchmarking study. So I'll now turn over to my colleague, Oliver Chapman, and he's going to provide a further framing presentation. Then we'll have a second presentation by Tony Joe Lebos, and then following that, we'll be opening the floor for what I hope will be an open and very interesting conversation with you. So thank you again for joining, and I'll pass over to Oliver. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Bruce. So I'm going to start the presentation by setting the scene with some synthesized knowledge on SOGIESC in Asia and the Pacific. You may have heard some of this information before, but please also bear in mind that this needs to be accessible to our various stakeholders, including governments and other clients who are new to the topic. We first wanted to give an overview of SOGIESC in Asia and the Pacific. So evidence suggests so this is the next slide in case you've not moved forward. Evidence suggests that sexual and gender minorities constitute a vulnerable population in the region as they continue to face widespread stigma, discrimination, and violence in many of ADB's developing member countries. The history of the region shows rich diversity of SOGIESC, including transgender Babaylan shamans of pre-colonial Philippines and third gender Hijra throughout South Asia, as well as other diverse identities across Asia and the Pacific. Partly due to colonial influences, third gender cultural institutions were undermined and sodomy was criminalized in many countries. Although restrictive laws remain in some countries, some have more recently made or considered legal reforms to support more inclusive approaches to inclusion on the basis of sexuality and gender identity. Today, there are a complex array of laws and regulations that influence inclusion on the basis of SOGIESC, both positively and negatively. A thriving civil society sector operating at both national and regional levels has in recent years been campaigning for liberalization of laws, social attitude change, enhanced service provision, and inclusive approaches in the private sector. Next slide, please. So now onto the risks faced by sexual and gender minorities. We found that sexual and gender minorities, by virtue of their SOGIESC, may be more likely to be adversely affected by project impacts or more constrained than others in their ability to take advantage of project benefits. This is because of cross-cutting and cross-sectoral risk factors, including discrimination and sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV. So on discrimination on the basis of SOGIESC can be direct or indirect. Discrimination means creating a distinction, exclusion, or restriction which has the purpose or effect of impairing or excluding a person based on their real or perceived SOGIESC. It affects project benefits, negative impacts, and opportunity to voice comments or concerns during stakeholder engagement and in grievance redress mechanisms. And on SGBV, sexual and gender minorities are at an elevated risk of sexual and gender-based violence. They often lack the necessary mechanisms to seek justice due to legal and social contexts. These risks are caused and magnified by both social stigma and lack of legal rights in many contexts. Next slide, please. We looked at several studies focusing on the Asia-Pacific region. And in a study conducted in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam by UNDP, Curtin University, and the Asia-Pacific Transgender Network, it was found that cisgender individuals, that's non-transgender people, were 54.5% more likely to be invited to a job interview when compared to transgender individuals having equivalent employment profiles. And a study by ILO and UNDP conducted in China, Philippines, and Thailand found that sexual and gender minorities face firstly limited legal protections from discrimination in the workplace. Second, often face negative or unequal treatment in actuality. And third, have little recourse to remedy mistreatment and discrimination. Next, a study by UNDP in Thailand, it was shown that lingering negative beliefs and attitudes towards sexual and gender minorities exist across multiple sectors, including health, education, and employment. And finally, the World Bank has done a preliminary assessment that sexual and gender minorities are likely overrepresented in the bottom 40% of the population in terms of real per capita income. Next slide, please. As shown in research by academics such as Lee Badgett, who is with us today, amongst others, there is evidence of causality linking SOGIESC inclusion to economic and social development. Drivers of economic losses due to exclusion on the basis of SOGIESC include lower productivity from discrimination in the workplace and wider economy, lower returns on education and training, lost output from health disparities, and inefficient expenditure on social and health services due to the effects of unequal treatment. These effects are reinforced by the knowledge and the assessment that a greater number than is typically assumed are of diverse SOGIESC, and this is somewhere between 5 and 20% of the population. Next slide, please. ADB and the World Bank are collaborating on a study on the legal barriers faced by sexual and gender minorities. Why are we doing this? Because we feel that legal barriers are foundational. They are specifically challenging for LGBTQ people across Asia Pacific and globally. And they are highly relevant for both safeguards and aspirational development work. Our work is kind of fairly unique and differs from other studies in two main ways. Firstly, it's operationally relevant to multilateral development banks. And secondly, it's highly detailed, which means we can be very nuanced in looking at the specific issues and how they might be addressed. There are 165 data points across 6 domains, and the domains are criminalization, access to inclusive education, access to the labour market, access to public services, civil and political inclusion, and protection from hate crimes. We are partway through data collection, but at a very high level, the issues which we're seeing, which won't be a surprise to many of you, are that people with diverse SOGIESC are facing legal discrimination in all sectors and in all countries in our sample. And some progress is being made in a handful of countries on partnership rights and anti-discrimination provisions. And only in Nepal are we seeing data being collected nationally on non-cisgender people. Before I hand over to next slide, please. Before I hand over to Tony Joe, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the issues we have heard from many of you who are here today. And of course, this is just the current list, and we're very much looking forward to hearing more. So firstly, there is strong evidence of diminished economic, social, and legal status of sexual and gender minorities. There are specific risk factors, including discrimination, stigma, and violence. Gender norms are critical in risk factors affecting people with diverse SOGIESC. The lack of data disaggregation currently that exists has a significant effect on policy and programs. The question of how do we conduct social impact assessments and action plans in order to mitigate the risk for people with diverse SOGIESC. The importance of intersectionality, which, as many of you know, is about multiple intersecting factors that increase vulnerability and exclusion. The need for capacity building on SOGIESC of ADB and governments, the need to address how to carry out meaningful consultations with minority communities, considering lack of visibility, stigma, and discrimination. Specific vulnerabilities on issues such as labour discrimination and resettlement, where people with diverse SOGIESC can be amongst the most marginalised and where they lack voice. And finally, to acknowledge the proposal we've received from various civil society representatives for a standalone standard within our framework on gender equality and SOGIESC. So with that, I'll now hand over to Tony Joe, who will talk about the benchmarking study we've carried out of comparator MFIs.
Thanks, Oliver, and hi, everyone. It's good to see so many of you here. My name is Tony Joe Labos, and I'm a consultant who has been advising the ADB team in their review of the SPS in relation to SOGIESC. In this section of the presentation, I will talk briefly about the benchmarking study we've conducted and its main findings. Next slide, please. So Oliver and Bruce already did a tremendous job setting up the context of the study, so I will not spend any time repeating what they've already said. Instead, I'll focus on the objectives, which were twofold. The first objective is to better understand some good practice on SOGIESC inclusion in ADB DMCs and in international development. So this includes understanding SOGIESC issues in Asia and the Pacific, understanding challenges faced by sexual and gender minorities in the region and more broadly, and understanding the linkages between SOGIESC and economic development. The second purpose is to compare ADB's current policies, strategies, and practices on SOGIESC to those used by peer MFIs. So this second objective includes both summarizing ADB's coverage of SOGIESC under existing policies, and secondly, conducting a benchmarking of other MFIs and their policies towards SOGIESC. So my presentation will focus primarily on the findings of the study, particularly as it relates to the second objective. Next slide, please. So to start with, how is SOGIESC already included in some of ADB's current policies and strategies? So ADB Strategy 2030, Operational Priority 1 on addressing remaining poverty and reducing inequalities recognizes sexual orientation as one of the social aspects that often determine people's participation, voice, rights, and access to resources and services. Similarly, operational priority 2, accelerating progress in gender equality, requires DMCs to address discrimination and disadvantages for women, including those disaggregated by class, ethnicity, indigenous status, sexual orientation and gender identity, religion, and migration. Also, while ADB's operational manual section C3 on the incorporation of social dimensions in ADB operations makes no explicit reference to SOGIESC issues, it does list social elements such as gender, ethnicity, race, caste, age, and others that may influence people's decision-making, access to services, resources, opportunity, and their ability to cope with risks. ADB's safeguard policy statement aims to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse environmental and social impacts, including protecting the rights of those likely to be affected or marginalized by the development process. So although the SPS does not explicitly mention the risks to sexual and gender minorities, it does not exclude them either. The SPS mentions that as part of social impact assessment, it will identify individuals and groups who may be differently or disproportionately affected by the project because of their disadvantage or vulnerable status. Furthermore, the SPS, which is again the current framework under meaningful consultations, also requires the process to be gender inclusive, responsive, and tailored to the needs of the disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. Now moving to the benchmarking analysis. The benchmarking analysis compares SOGIESC-related policies, standards, and resources present in other comparator MFIs. The recently updated MFI safeguard frameworks are using different approaches to address SOGIESC in their operations. So some MFIs have incorporated explicit provisions in their safeguard standards, and others have developed tools, procedures, and good practice notes that can be used during project design and implementation by staff and borrowers. The benchmarking analysis we've done, therefore, is based on 3 key criteria. The first one is the inclusion of SOGIESC provisions in the MFI's policies and standard. The second criteria is the presence of operational SOGIESC-related guidance material for staff and clients. So these include guidance notes and good practice notes. And then the third criteria is the presence of full-time staff focused on providing SOGIESC-related support. Next slide, please. So I will start by, first of all, covering some acronyms for the different MFIs. So the ADB stands obviously for Asian Development Bank. The AIIB stands for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The IFC stands for the International Finance Corporation. The IDB stands for the Inter-American Development Bank. And the EBRD stands for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So under the first criteria of inclusion of SOGIESC provisions in the MFI safeguard policies and standards, we find that ADB's SPS from 2009 does not have explicit reference to SOGIESC. So there is no specific SOGIESC-related safeguard standards or policies in place that mandate the protection of sexual and gender minorities in ADB projects. Among the comparator MFIs, the AIIB's revised environmental and social framework specified its enhanced commitment to gender equality without explicit reference to sexual and gender minorities. Similarly, the World Bank did not make explicit reference to SOGIESC issues in the main body of its environmental and social framework, but provided coverage of sexual and gender minorities as a category of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups under its directive on addressing risks and impacts on disadvantaged or vulnerable individuals and groups. The EBRD and IDB explicitly refer to sexual and gender minorities as a vulnerable group. The IFC, EBRD, and IDB all include SOGIESC as potential discriminatory grounds in employment under the requirements for labor and working conditions. And then furthermore, the IDB's environmental and social policy also stresses the need for the client to identify and address risks, impact, and access to opportunity that may disproportionately affect people because of their disadvantage or vulnerable status, including sexual and gender minorities. It also requires the borrower to provide special measures of protection and assistance to address the vulnerabilities of project workers, including people of diverse SOGIESC, and address measures to prevent and address violence, harassment, intimidation, and/or exploitation. The IDB framework also includes provisions to take into account concerns of sexual and gender minorities through the stakeholder engagement process in determining priority services and engaging throughout the project lifecycle through meaningful consultation. So out of these, notably the IDB's ESP has more explicit and specific coverage of SOGIESC issues overall. Next slide, please. Under the second criteria relating to the presence of operational SOGIESC related guidance material for staff and clients, we find that among the MFIs, the ADB, the AIIB, the IFC, the EBRD, and the IDB have not published SOGIESC specific guidance material for the implementation of their respective safeguard frameworks. The World Bank, however, has developed a good practice note on non-discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity to support ESF implementation. So the good practice note guides thinking around SOGIESC issues in development projects and structures implementation support to the borrower in addressing the risk of discrimination. In the good practice note, non-discrimination based on SOGIESC is set out at different stages of the project lifecycle, including scoping, assessment, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and meaningful stakeholder engagement. Other MFIs, such as the IDB, have worked and contributed to SOGIESC-specific research. The IFC has also published an emerging practice report that elaborates on good practice for advancing the economic inclusion of sexual and gender minorities. The EBRD has as well published various SOGIESC-related research studies. Next slide, please. Lastly, under the third criteria relating to the presence of full-time staff focused on providing SOGIESC-related support, we find that the AIIB, the EBRD, and IDB do not have full-time staff exclusively working on SOGIESC, but they do hire consultants on an ad hoc basis for support on SOGIESC-specific tasks. So while there are no full-time staff solely focused on SOGIESC issues at the ADB, staff at the institution have supported SOGIESC-related tasks at the request of certain clients. The ADB also hires consultants to support on SOGIESC-specific issues. Lastly, at the IFC, the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group leads on support for SOGIESC matters in the institution. So staff at the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group typically focus on a set of topics, including gender, SOGIESC, and disability. The World Bank, on the other hand, has a global advisor on SOGI, supported by a full-time social development analyst and a small team of consultants. Their work supports World Bank teams in their proactive agenda on SOGIESC inclusion in projects and supports project teams in design, implementation, and monitoring of projects in accordance with the ESF. So some key tasks for the advisor include the inclusion of SOGIESC issues in country partnership frameworks and undertaking strategic country diagnostics to generate data and analytics related to SOGIESC, capacity building for World Bank staff in headquarters and in country offices on SOGI and inclusive development, capacity building to project task team leaders on ESF requirements in relation to SOGI, and providing resources and tools to project teams and clients to address SOGIESC issues within safeguards. And lastly, providing guidance and advice to senior management in challenging contexts. Next slide, please. So based on the study analysis, some issues for further consideration in the SPS review and update include, first of all, the inclusion of sexual and gender minorities as a category under the definition of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. Another recommendation is incorporating SOGIESC specific provisions in the revised policy and borrower requirements on issues such as labor standards and resettlement. The preparation of tools, guidance notes for screening, scoping, implementation, and monitoring of SOGIESC measures in accordance with the revised SPS, ensuring adequate SOGIESC-specific resources and staffing at the ADB for the implementation and monitoring of SOGIESC issues in accordance with the revised SPS, providing capacity building on non-discrimination based on SOGIESC to both ADB staff and project executing and or implementing agencies. And lastly, engaging in regional SOGIESC specific knowledge generation through partnerships with other international organizations, as well as with civil society organizations which operate at the regional and at the country levels. So I will stop my part of the presentation here and hand it back to Azim to introduce the moderated discussion part of the consultation. Thank you so much.
To all three of our presenters, thank you very much. Thanks Oliver Chapman and Tony Jo Lebos for your very comprehensive and detailed presentations and for the overviews on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics you've raised for all of us to consider. These presentations offer us clarity and present some of the unique challenges which have been raised by ADB's Independent Evaluation Department publicly and need to be considered in the revision of the safeguards policy by around March of 2023. The comparative analyses on SOGIESC presented by Tony will need to be considered in how, be considered by Tony Jo, will need to be considered in how the ADB becomes a leader in incorporating SOGIESC issues in the revised safeguards policy. Of particular interest are the benchmarks and alignment and the analyses of comparator MFIs to SOGIESC and how the ADB strategy 2030 and more specifically its OP1 and OP2 as well as section C3BP from the operations manual needs to be inclusive and mainstreamed, as Tony Jo Lebos mentioned. We hope we can get to feedback and an opportunity to delve into some of these issues during the discussions arising from the Q&A session that's going to be coming up very shortly. But before we do that, just a reminder that these sessions, the Q&A component at least, will run for about 70 to 75 minutes, then will be facilitated by Heidi Eer-Dupuy. Just a short note that if you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, please send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, select either Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino as the recipient of the message. Jennifer and Niel are members of our team working behind the scenes, and they will then repost your question to protect your identity and offer you anonymity if that's what you prefer. Let's now pause for a 5-minute break. Before we do, can I please invite you to think about our poll evaluation that we will have coming up a little bit later on. But if you wish to register your written feedback now to improve our consultation approaches, the link to menti.com is posted in the chat box. We also have a post-event evaluation questionnaire for you to complete, and the links for both of these are in the chat box. But just to advise you that we will have this coming up. So before you get your tea, your coffee, or favorite drink, just a heads up on some guide questions you'll see on the screen now. These will help facilitate and direct and manage the Q&A session. In the top right-hand corner, you will see a countdown timer for 5 minutes. When that countdown timer approaches or reaches 0, you'll know that it's time to return to your screens as the consultation is about to resume. We will also be playing some background music, and as that music begins to fade, if you've stepped away from your screen, it'll also give you an indication that we're about to restart. So with that, let's take a 5-minute break, and when we resume, we'll have the Q&A session as facilitated by Heidi Eer-Dupuy. But for now, we're just going to take a bit of a breather and see you in 5. Thanks very much and welcome back. We will now have the Q&A discussion as facilitated by Heidi Dupuy, who is the head of the NGO and Civil Society Center within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. You will continue to see some guide questions flashed on the screen, which we also had during the break. But please feel free to also share your experiences on how the ADB can better target or improve SOGIESC issues in the revision of the 2009 Safeguards Policy Statement as aligned to ADB Strategy 2030 and the OP1 and OP2 specifically, which Oliver Chapman and Tony Jo Lebos mentioned. A reminder that you can ask questions through posting them in the chat box or through virtually raising your hand in the Zoom feature by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, and Heidi will call upon you directly. A further reminder that should you wish to raise a question or share an experience anonymously, you can send the message in the chat box, but instead of selecting to everyone in the chat, please just select either Jennifer DeBellin or Niel Aquino, and either Jennifer or Niel are happy to receive these inputs and will then repost your question or comment or issue under their own name, offering you an opportunity to have your identity protected and be anonymous. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before we turn you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and next steps following this consultation. So with that, I turn it over to you, please, Heidi.
Thank you, Azim, and thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in and participating in this event with us today. And we have already 3 raised hands or 3 interested participants in contributing to the discussion. So we'll go ahead and take the first 3 questions or comments. I will, and then we will turn to ADB to respond. But mostly this evening, we would like to listen to you and hear your perspective and your voices. I think we will start first with Elaine Zuckerman and then followed by Lee Badgett and then Doug Kerr. So Elaine, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Hope you can all hear me. Good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you all are. We really appreciate this consultation, and my ADB colleagues or our ADB colleagues in this call have heard my views before. I'd like to build on the views that I've expressed previously and also the views that Tony and Oliver presented today. So Gender Action, the organization for which I work, has promoted SOGI safeguards in all the multilateral development banks now for years. And we also benchmarked all the IFIs. I know that some of our IDB colleagues, Bruce, for example, know this because we sent our findings previously to you. And you could say, building on Tony's findings, Gender Action found similar findings that Tony did. However, we found in writing the IDB has the strongest freestanding and the only really freestanding gender standard. That includes SOGI. And we believe strongly that the ADB must approve a freestanding gender and SOGI safeguard. However, there is one way that it could improve on the IDBs, and that is the IDB's, I think, shortcoming of its freestanding gender and SOGI safeguard, known as the gender equality safeguard, is that it doesn't intersectionally address SOGI gender issues with climate change and other intersectional issues. So I think that's one thing to take into account. I think also that the criticism, I don't know if it was presented as a criticism, so I will, that the World Bank's environmental and social framework has a companion directive that Tony mentioned that includes SOGI within vulnerable groups is highly deficient. It is not a model. It is not a good model. It's a weak example. And in contrast to what may appear to be the World Bank's strong infrastructure, for example, in staffing. And I think Tony mentioned that this group, the gender expert and the one full-time staff and the consultants, are ensuring that investments address SOGIE issues, that they include SOGIE, let's call it LGBTQI folk, as beneficiaries and try to prevent non-discrimination. If you dig in, as a number of folk on this call, civil society folk on this call have been doing, the very limited staff have been able to do so little operationally, we find. So another colleague on the call has actually looked at which operations the World Bank has been able to address SOGIE issues in, or how many, better put, or another way of putting it is just how many of the World Bank operations meaningfully, not just mention, but meaningfully address SOGIE issues. Very, 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 very few. A handful or less. So I guess in wrapping up, I want to say that it's absolutely essential for the ADB to have a freestanding SOGIE safeguard that is not part of a broad vulnerable one, you know, just that mentions in parentheses a whole bunch of vulnerable groups or has a paragraph or two on each vulnerable group. You really need to have, like the IDB has, a freestanding, robust, mandatory SOGIE and gender safeguard, rather than the alternative of including SOGIE within other vulnerable groups. And of course, the most important thing is then to implement that new ADB freestanding SOGIE and gender safeguard. You know, that's obviously completely essential. And it sounds to me like, given the amount of research you've been putting into benchmarking other NDBs, looking at what the ADB has historically done for SOGIESC issues, that you are committed. And you have to take that to the most effective step that you can take at this point when you're creating or updating and modernizing your safeguards to have a freestanding gender and SOGIE safeguard. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. We'll turn over now to Professor Lee Badgett. Professor, go ahead.
Hi, good morning from our end of things. Thank you very much. And I guess I want to build a little bit on some of the comments that Oliver, Tony Jo, and Elaine just made, and want to say that I support the addition of a standalone gender and SOGIESC safeguard. Getting messages about starting my video. So I support the addition of the standalone safeguard because I think it's a crucial first step towards full inclusion of LGBTI people in the ADB's work. And I won't do more than just nod to Oliver's great points about the need for data and what the data already show us about the issues that LGBT people face. But I want to kind of build a little bit from the really interesting and important work that Tony Jo just outlined about where things are. And the one thing that I'm not hearing very much about is through all of those different frameworks and programs, how many LGBTI people are actually being served by projects at the various development banks. Just to give you a little bit of perspective on this, some colleagues and I co-authored a study to identify and analyze existing projects designed to promote livelihoods for low-income LGBTI people, which is an example of a type of a project that I think is relevant for ADB's work. And we found 21 projects that were explicitly inclusive of LGBTI people in Asia. And that included a few government-based projects and one or two being supported by USAID, but we didn't see projects that were explicitly tied to the development banks for the most part. They were mostly projects begun by LGBTI NGOs because they were the only game in town, basically, to help provide skills, job support services, entrepreneurship training, microcredit to LGBTI people, but they were all very, very small, really the proverbial drop in the bucket. And so when I think about, kind of all the various intricate policies and frameworks and guidelines and advice, and the operationalization of this, at the end of the day, we're just not seeing LGBTI people being served by the existing projects. And I'll just give you two perspectives on very large scale projects that have the potential to make a big difference in LGBTI people's lives that have not actually done so. So one is some of the efforts by the Indian government, a South Asian country, to include specifically transgender people in their livelihoods efforts. And they advertise that they are open to transgender people being included. And yet at the end of the day, the one project that could identify any transgender people could identify exactly 7 transgender people that have been served by their policies. This is not limited to Asia or Uruguay, which is famous for having a 1% quota for transgender workers in public sector jobs, which is seen as a very progressive policy to help transgender people. That country hired 19,000 people into the public service in their most recent reported data, exactly 3 of whom were transgender people. So a long way from that 1% figure. So something is happening in these projects that at least say that they are explicitly open to LGBTI people, and it's just not, something is getting in the way of people being served, being included in those kinds of projects. So I think, this is exactly why we need a safeguard to make sure that people are likely to be beneficiaries and to get the services that they need from places like the ADB. So I am happy to have had a chance to have made this contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Next we have Doug Kerr. Doug, please. Hello, Doug. Are you still there? Oh, okay. I think Doug is not on the call. So thank you very much for our first 2 speakers. We would like to now turn over to let's see, the question on Elaine made some questions and actually made some comments on the need for a standalone. I think both speakers had talked about the standalone standards and some assessments of the IDB standards and how ADB can actually go beyond that. So I like to call on Director Bruce Dunn to give some I guess responses on the directions of ADB safeguards after today's discussion. Bruce?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Heidi. And again, thank you so much for everyone for joining. And to Elaine Zuckerman from Gender Action and Professor Lee Badgett, appreciate those first comments that you've shared with us. A lot of really important points that definitely resonate with me personally, and I'm sure with the team. Just to back up, I want to recognize firstly recommendations from both of you, and I'm sure that many others will also share those recommendations during this session on the need for a focused standalone freestanding standard on gender equality and SOGIESC in the safeguards. It is something that we are considering, but there's no final decision on that as yet. There's still a lot of discussions that are being had inside ADB, and also we still have quite a long way to go in our discussions with various different stakeholders, including our board, as well as developing member countries. We'll be positioning quite soon from these regional consultations to a series of consultations that we'll be doing in countries. So starting to travel again, so we'll be going out to visit a number of countries to get views. So it's something that still needs to be followed through and to have a look and see how things can integrate. We are looking at the benchmarking, as you've seen, and so of course we are looking at various different models. I'm interested, I appreciated, Elaine, your thoughts around why it's important to have a dedicated standard, but also you said quite clearly that you thought that the way the World Bank had gone with integration under sort of vulnerability and disadvantaged groups more broadly was not the way to go. I'm interested to hear more for your thoughts on that, just to unpack that a little bit, because it's certainly, there are various different views being expressed, and I think it's important in a forum such as this for us to be able to weigh those. So I'm very much open to hearing sort of various different views on that today. But I guess the key thing coming out also from Elaine's points and also from Professor Lee Badgett, the number of projects that are actually taking an approach to inclusion or looking at it from a more safeguards, do no harm lens, very, very small. I think that's also characteristic of ADB at this stage. We are starting certainly to do more, particularly in our South Asia team, through a gender equality and social inclusion approach. There's a number of country dialogues, analytical work, and projects that are starting to have more inclusion, but I think they obviously have still quite a bit of way to go to get to the sort of scale that's obviously necessary to support inclusion. Just a final point, so try not to speak too long in these interventions so that we can hear more from others. We're actually doing two things at the moment in ADB. These consultations and this process is focused on the safeguards, and the safeguards focus on ADB traditionally has been around more management of impacts and risks, the do no harm agenda. But we have a very strong strategy and proactive agenda across a number of areas. And you heard during the earlier presentation about the operational priorities that we have on gender equality, on poverty and social development, social protection. So there's a proactive agenda there as well. And there's discussions around how does the SOGIESC agenda get brought forward more clearly, more direction in that proactive agenda, as well as to the safeguards. So there's two tracks, and that's just one thing that we may come back to and distinguish during this consultation a little bit to see where things should sit in terms of that proactive agenda versus the safeguards. Obviously, there's linkages between, but that's also something we're wanting to make a distinction on. Anyway, for now, I'll finish. We're here to listen and be keen to hear from others or further from Elaine and Lee Badgett as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Elaine and Lee, would you like to come in again? Elaine, yes, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Bruce, thanks for asking for more details on why I feel that the World Bank model is not a good one. It was just hugely disappointing that the World Bank's environmental and social framework updated, was it 2018, I think, when it was approved, hardly mentions gender equality, gender issues at all in the entire environmental and social framework. Even the old binary gender equality is neglected. That was a very big disappointment from the start, not to speak of including sexual and gender minorities. So we made a big fuss. Actually, I can't tell you how many times? They must have had, I think they had 4 consultations, at least 3 written consultations where we asked for a mandatory, robust, freestanding gender and SOGIE safeguard. We didn't get it. And the reason was, they said, because, you know, you have board members who don't like this. So they came out with this subsequent directive that said would be inclusive of all these vulnerable groups. And then there's this long string of vulnerable groups presented in parentheses, you know, including probably, I forget the language, but something like SOGIE, I think it was the language, rather than say LGBTQI. And having been a former World Banker myself, I don't know if you all know that, but I worked there for about a dozen years and in the IDB for 8 years. I know that staff and the client countries will not pay attention to anything that is not explicitly required and that is not mandatorily required. And I guess explicitly is the key word here, because the directive just mentions in passing SOGIE as well as other gender issues groups. And the ESF itself doesn't do so at all. That provides no signal to staff and clients. It's really, really weak. It's been now over 5 years, I would guess, but others on the call, Chad, for example, could correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels to me over 5 years since the senior advisor at the World Bank for SOGIE was hired. And since then, we have just a handful of studies and a handful, meaning, you know, probably 5 or less, a handful of projects that address these issues. And I think the whole structure has been flawed from the beginning. It's one to be avoided. It does not provide clear signals to staff and clients, that structure. The IDBs, in contrast, very explicitly has a mandatory gender SOGIE standard or safeguard, whatever you want to call it. They call it standard. And I think it does provide a clear signal that's needed to staff and clients. But of course, implementation is another issue. The ADB needs to get it right on both counts. Have the freestanding gender SOGIE safeguard that's mandatory, robust, and lays out everything explicitly. And then, of course, you must be sure to implement it. That way you'll have the best of all the existing benchmarks out there and do even better than they do. Thanks.
Thank you,
I
Elaine.
hope that answers your question, Bruce.
Yes, thank you, Elaine.
Thank you, Elaine.
I see Lee with the video on. Any additional comments from you? And then I'll go to the next 3 hands raised. Thank you.
Yes, super briefly, just in terms of the proactive agenda, I think the ADB could be really important in getting the kind of data and research that will show how LGBTI people really live. And that's the only way you're going to know whether the laws that you're tracking are making any difference whatsoever when they're more inclusive. But I think that this is a tremendously important role that could be played by ADB.
Yes, thank you
Thanks.
very much. Yes, now we have three more hands raised, 4 more hands, but I will take the next 3 speakers, Gabrielle, and then Phil, and then Justus. Gabrielle, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Heidi. I am Gabrielle. I work at the Office of the Human Rights in Geneva at the UN. And I would like to bring the attention to 5 points. I think a few of them that have been touched by our other advocates. The UN Human Rights Office strongly supports the need for a self-standing safeguard on gender equality that addresses the full range of rights of women and girls, and the rights of LGBTIQ+ persons, situating sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics within the context of a gender equality standalone safeguard has an important substantive basis because violence and discrimination against LGBTIQ+ people are rooted in negative gender stereotypes and perceptions that LGBTIQ+ people defy gender norms. Also, due to the fact that LGBT persons face specific criminal sanctions and face targeted violence, discrimination, and exclusion, and that financial and other institutions have historically been reluctant to address due to stigma and negative stereotypes. The ADB's Independent Evaluation Office noted in 2020's SPS evaluation the risk aversion of ADB operational staff in relation to social impact assessment compared to environmental IA. A self-standing goal and clear binding requirements can help address this problem, we believe. We also support, as mentioned by Elaine, an intersectional approach to other forms of discrimination throughout the new safeguards to ensure that no one is left behind. Second point is that we stress the importance that safeguards, including gender equality and SOGIESC issues, are aligned with international norms and standards, including on human rights, gender equality, and labor. Third point, it relates to the current regional and context. So at the moment in Asia and Pacific, while there have been positive developments in some countries, there continues to be high levels of violence and discrimination against women and girls, and as well as LGBTIQ+ persons. Many existing laws in the region are not aligned with international norms and standards, and there are gaps in national protection systems and access to remedy for victims of abuses. For example, 2/3 of the countries in the region have less than 60% labor force participation of women, fewer than 20% of parliamentarians are women, and there are also low levels of representation leadership in the private sector. McKinsey study highlights that the region is losing 12% in potential GDP, equivalent to $4.5 trillion in annual GDP as a result of gender inequality. On SOGIESC, there are some positive developments, including the recent decriminalization of consensual same-sex relations in India and Bhutan, court judgments and initiatives on the rights of trans people in India, Pakistan, Nepal, and greater visibility and strength of SOGIESC civil society organizations. At the same time, half of the countries in the region criminalize consensual same-sex relations. Some also explicitly criminalize transgender persons. Fewer than half have laws in place on recognition of the gender identity of trans people, and many of these have abusive requirements. Only 20% of countries in the region have protections from discrimination bans on sexual orientation, and the number are much lower in relation to trans persons, and very few protect intersex people. Fourth point, as previously spoken, we recognize the IDB safeguards as good practice among MDBs insofar as self-standing gender equality and SOGI standard is concerned. It has good integration of specific issues relating to gender equality and the rights of women, which is critical for our office. One point on LGBTIQ+ persons we would strengthen vis-a-vis the IDB safeguard is to better integrate sex characteristics and the rights of intersex people. And another one is on the actual implementation of safeguards. A good aspect of the IDB gender equality safeguard is that it explicitly addresses unpaid care work, SGBV, intersectionality, narrowing existing inequalities and gaps, disproportionate impact on women and girls and LGBTIQ+ persons, child sexual exploitation and abuse, displacement, resettlement, labor rights, and participation. These are all concrete areas that are of high relevance to ADB-funded projects and need to be explicitly addressed to ensure the issues faced by women and girls and as well as LGBTIQ+ persons are adequately tackled. Finally, we strongly encourage ADB to ensure meaningful participation of local CSO partners in the Asia-Pacific region, working on gender equality, women's rights, and the rights of LGBTIQ+ persons, in shaping the proposed standard and ensuring it reflects the needs of interests of right holders in the region. And on the discussion that we just had now, I work at the LGBTI cluster specifically, and we have a team for that. We have other teams that are focused in other issues. We have had a gender mainstream policy. We have now we're working on LGBTI mainstream policy. So we do understand that general and robust general safeguards or policies they can bring important aspects, because we have the notion that we're all the same, but at the same time we strongly believe that specific safeguards and specific policies focused on LGBTI and women, they can bring a very detailed experience and expertise that are owned by this group of people and experts. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gabrielle. We now turn to Phil. Go ahead, Phil.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good evening. My name is Phil Crehan. I'm with the Micro Rainbow International Foundation. I had an entire presentation ready to go, but I'm scratching it all to address 4 points, 4 important points that have come up that I do not believe are that we really must address. Before I jump into those 4 points, I'll say that it's good that we go into the social, the economic and political challenges that LGBTQ+ people experience in their countries, because those are quite significant. What we've not addressed sufficiently is the exclusion that the community faces from traditional development, because traditional development has effectively excluded them and not prioritized their specific and unique concerns. So those two things are very important together, the exclusion that they face in their countries, in their cultures, but also from development. For me, the only thing that could possibly get us to address that exclusion socially, culturally, but also institutionally via development is a standalone safeguard when it comes to gender and SOGIESC issues. That is very important to set out right away. What we've been talking about, I think through Elaine especially, is this juxtaposition between the IDB's model, their ESPF, and then the World Bank's model, the ESF. When it comes to the IDB's ESPF, it is something I worked with them extensively on externally to push them to make sure that SOGIESC was sufficiently included into their gender standalone but also to work to ensure that SOGIESC issues were included throughout the document and other entry points, stakeholder consultations, social impact assessments, language of vulnerability. That's super important that it's not only one standalone, but it's throughout the document itself. For me, that is the model. And as Elaine said, that is the model that can only get us to work, that is only commensurate with the exclusion that the community faces in their cultures and societies, and also the exclusion that they've faced from development. Turn to the other side, and I wholeheartedly agree with Elaine. When we look at the World Bank's ESF, it is highly ineffective. And I say this as someone who worked with OPCS internally at the bank to deliver a SOGI good practice note, right? And the problem with this good practice note is that it's not led to anything quite meaningfully. This is a point that I believe Lee mentioned. What is the impact of the bank's ESF? What is the impact of their good practice note? It is barely anything. And this is so unfortunate, because when we look at actually how much the ESF has influenced stakeholder engagement plans or commitment plans, some of the most pivotal documents through the bank and client safeguards interactions, there's almost nothing when it comes to LGBT or SOGI. So for me, this shows highly ineffective World Bank model. This is extraordinarily important to say, because I'm reading through this benchmarking exercise that Tony Joe presented on, and I will say that there are some very good points to this. It is also absolutely a draft, in my opinion. When we look at the indicators of what would show us the best models, we see that there are policies, guidance, and staff. What is missing from this? I believe Lee mentioned we must include an indicator of success, the impact. What is the impact of these safeguard documents on the LGBT+ community? What is the impact on the clients who are borrowing these tremendous amounts of money? So for me, this benchmarking exercise absolutely has to include a fourth indicator, which is the impact of these things. And that's important because in this document itself, I don't know what page, but it says, almost by quote, it says the IDB and the World Bank has the most robust document when it comes to SOGIESC inclusion. That's not true, right? The IDB has the most robust way of looking at SOGIESC issues because, again, it is in the standalone document and it is mainstream throughout the document itself. The World Bank's ESF It is not there. It is not in the safeguards ESF itself. It is barely there in a good practice note that has not impacted the actual clients, nor is there an impact on the LGBTQ plus community. I really must stress this because what we see from development institutions is a magnetism toward the World Bank that adopts some of their standards and some of their best practices. And in this case, we absolutely cannot fall into that trap of going toward the World Bank model on LGBTQ plus issues. We must be rather inspired by Latin America and the Caribbean, the IDB's model. We have to get this into a standalone that looks at gender as well as SOGIESC. We have to get this mainstream throughout the document. That is extraordinarily important. I'll finish it out by saying there's a few things that came up. Data, the ECOSOGI research, that's fantastic. Research inherently is good. It's a good thing. It is even better when this ECOSOGI legal and policy analysis is coupled with economic analysis. So I say this because the original World Bank report comes from women, business, and the law. The strength of women, business, and law is laws and policy as coupled with a macroeconomic analysis. What is the impact on development? Once you couple legal policies, laws and policies with an economic analysis, that is the strength for the clients. That is what they look toward development banks for. So ECOSOGI, great, add some economic analysis. That's where it becomes cutting edge. That's what I really support. Another important point, what I see as an extraordinary limitation that has not come up is the ADB's use of gender, and it's by a gender binary. So there was a 1999 or 2000 gender policy that was updated in 2018 or 2019. I read it. It still absolutely looks at gender as binary male or female, which is extraordinarily complicated and dangerous for LGBTQ plus people. It is also a limiting factor in the creation, I believe, of other documents, other diagnostics throughout the ADB, but most importantly, for poverty and social analysis. So what we're really pushing by having a robust definition of gender, including SOGIESC, is really getting us out of that gender binary, and is showing us ways to create all the tools necessary that safeguards must utilize, but especially the poverty and social analysis. We have to look at this outside of the binary. We have to look at this much more robust way. So that when we're actually implementing these safeguard documents, what is on paper, it actually incorporates and includes LGBTQ plus people. That is not only a good thing, morally, that is actual development. That is the direction we're going into. That is the development I support. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I'd like to check with Justus to see if you still would like to come in. I've seen that you lowered your hand.
Yes, I would absolutely. Sorry, I got disconnected for a second, and that's when my hand was automatically lowered. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I agree with much of what the previous speakers have said, especially around the need for a standalone guideline and the explicit mentioning of LGBTIQ plus people and SOGIESC issues in a standalone guideline. I strongly believe in starting from how many LGBTIQ plus people's lives have been improved as a result of a policy or a guideline, and that is coupled with starting with looking at the people who are currently most affected by economic deprivation and inequality. From the little data that we have on that, for example, the large-scale study that the EU Fundamental Rights Agency did, we know that intersex people are affected by far the most by economic deprivation of all people in the LGBTIQ plus spectrum. And I believe that is where we should start any kind of design of interventions, by looking at who is affected most, and then why are people affected by economic deprivation, and how do these mechanisms work. And when we look at the specific example of intersex people, laws generally don't have a lot to do with that. It starts with families rejecting intersex babies when they're born. It starts with medical and other healers inflicting trauma on intersex people with unnecessary medical procedures that then later translate into issues of attending school, being able to have a diploma, being excluded from social groups in schools and later out throughout their lives. And the list goes on and on. Laws generally don't come into this at all for intersex people, yet what I hear is a strong emphasis on looking at laws as a driver of inequality. So I would like to suggest to the ADB to reconsider that focus on the legal agenda, which I think is an important one, nevertheless, for LGBT people. But it leaves out the one community within the spectrum that is most affected by inequality, at least that we know of from the little data that we have from the few places where intersex people have been included in sound data collection. I would also highlight that the premise of do no harm shouldn't stop at doing nothing. Do no harm is also doing nothing can cause great harm. When people are not included, that causes them great harm. When people are left out of programs, that causes them great harm. So I believe the premise of do no harm has an active duty included in it, and I'm very happy to hear that the ADB is willing to take a proactive approach, because that is really what is needed right now. That LGBTIQ+ people are actively included in the ADB's loans and programs. Generally, when we think of inclusion, we often think of mainstreaming, and mainstreaming is often defined as a program designed for a majority to include a small minority. That requires a lot of work on behalf of the majority to gain the cultural competence to meaningfully include the minority. I don't think that's the most effective way we can mainstream. I think we can also think of mainstreaming the other way around, of a minority being entrusted with resources to provide services for all. And we've seen that works in projects in the Philippines, for example. We've seen that works in LGBTIQ+ people providing services for refugees in Ukraine. We've seen that it works in community health centers in the US that are designed to serve everybody, but that are run by LGBTIQ+ communities. So with that, I would like to finish my intervention for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have quite a few of participants wanting to comment and speak. So I will give the opportunities to a few more speakers before we will make short responses. Next, we have Christina, and then we'll go to Leo. Christina, go ahead.
Hello, and thank you for hosting this important consultation. I'm a professor at the University of Colorado School of Law, and I'm speaking on behalf of First Peoples Worldwide, a nonprofit working at the intersection of business law and finance to further Indigenous rights. First Peoples encourages the Asian Development Bank to adopt and implement a gender and SOGIESC safeguard that is inclusive of LGBTQIA and Two-Spirit Indigenous peoples. It is critical to have a safeguard that explicitly integrates LGBTQ+ Indigenous individuals and adopts an intersectional understanding of their experiences. For example, Indigenous peoples have historically been subjected to racist and colonial laws and policies. These laws and policies have also attempted to erase and criminalize LGBTQ+ Indigenous peoples. A cornerstone right of Indigenous peoples, as articulated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is the right to self-determination, or the right to freely determine one's political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. The declaration has been endorsed by 144 countries, including all but 2 countries in Asia. Respecting one's Indigenous and LGBTQ+ identity is also respecting the right to self-determination. Integrating the declaration means that there are other implicated rights to consider when understanding impacts to LGBTQ+ Indigenous peoples. For example, we know that Indigenous peoples experience high levels of involuntary resettlement compared to non-Indigenous peoples. This then means that Indigenous LGBTQ+ individuals are disproportionately removed from their lands. Indigenous peoples have unique rights to their lands, territories, and resources as articulated in the Declaration, and thus their forcible removal is a violation of a number of these rights specific to their Indigenous identity. Therefore, the ADB safeguards must be inclusive of the intersecting identities of LGBTQ+ Indigenous individuals. First Peoples also commends the ADB for including Indigenous peoples in its analytical studies. We ask that ADB endeavor to robustly incorporate Indigenous rights and the outcomes of their analysis throughout the safeguard. Instead of cabining the analysis and safeguards to an Indigenous specific section, we encourage the ADB to examine how the safeguard can be most supportive of intersecting identities throughout its gender and SOGIESC safeguards. At First Peoples, we have seen that policies often fail in practice when they don't account for how Indigenous rights can be implemented within each unique policy or each stage of a development. One way to ensure robust integration of Indigenous rights is to include the right to free, prior, and informed consent throughout the safeguards. Again, we encourage the ADB to adopt and implement a specific gender and SOGIESC safeguard. Thank you so much for your consideration.
Thank you, Christina. Next, we have Leo with your hand raised. Please, Leo.
Thank you so much for hosting this. And hello, everyone. My name is Leo Goldsmith. I am a climate and health specialist that has conducted research at Yale University to identify the unique risks of environmental and climate impacts on sexual and gender minorities. I want to advocate for a separate gender SOGIESC safeguard being adopted by the Asian Development Bank, and that it is incorporated in all of ADB's activities, especially in areas that sexual and gender minorities have not been brought up yet on this call, such as environment, climate, and disasters. I am happy to say that I am not alone in this, as the Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth US, and Greenpeace US has also endorsed the standalone safeguard drafted by civil society and presented it to the bank. Sexual and gender minorities worldwide face social, economic, and health disparities due to inequitable laws and policies. Sexual and gender minorities have been found to experience disproportionate impacts to disasters in the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, India, Samoa, Australia, and New Zealand. Sexual and gender minorities are invisible within disaster preparedness, reduction, and response policies, and refused aid and services after a disaster. Equitable climate, disaster, and sustainable development funding and projects requires the specific consideration of SOGIESC in order to increase their adaptive capacity to disasters and other environmental hazards through better education, poverty relief, promoting acceptance and reducing violence, increasing affirming healthcare access, and advocating for equitable policies and laws. It is also imperative to mitigate the unique harms that occur in sexual and gender minorities and to work with in-country and regional LGBTQ+ organizations and communities to best serve their needs. Therefore, I want to reiterate that I support a separate gender SOGIESC safeguard being adopted by the Asian Development Bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. I have two comments here I would like to read quickly, and then we'll go to Julie next. After I read the comments from Chloe from the Center for Values in International Development. Chloe stated that while procedural changes are being discussed in the SOGIESC safeguards discourse are essential to improve development processes and outcomes, real change will only be driven and sustained by a change in government and popular understandings. Discrimination, violence, and exclusion have their roots in entrenched moral, religious, and cultural values. How best can the proposed standalone SOGIESC safeguards, which we support, serve to change ADB programming to transform political will and social acceptance? That's the question. And then Chloe thanks Lee Badgett for comments on who within the SOGIESC community is actually being served. And then why SOGI is a useful umbrella, the diversity under this acronym does need to be disaggregated in ADB programming. For example, transgender men and intersex people and are largely invisible in ADB countries. And then the next comment we have is from Fabrice from Out Leadership. Fabrice agrees with Elaine that the mainstreaming of LGBTQ plus people among vulnerable population in the World Bank concretely resulted in bank teams continuing to avoid addressing a topic that development practitioners unfortunately still see as irrelevant and frivolous. The cultural stigma in the development world attached to sexual orientation and gender identity make it different from other marginalized communities such as the Dalit people in India, Roma people in Europe, or Batwa people in Congo, which World Bankers are willing to consider but not protect. So these are the comments made in the chat. And next we can, okay, I think at this point we will go to a few quick responses because I think we had quite a few comments already made. And so we'll try to keep our responses short, and then we'll go to the next three hands after that. Julie, thanks for your patience. We'll go to short answers from ADB, and then we'll revert back to you, the participants. So I think at this point, we like to invite our colleague from the social sector to come in. We have Malika from our gender team, who can share a little bit about ADB's incorporation of gender into our project. And then we have Madhu from our social safeguards perspective. And then our colleague Wendy, who heads the social thematic group, the thematic groups in ADB can also come in and share a little bit about how ADB incorporates the development side of SOGIESC and other inclusion into ADB's work, projects and investments. So Malika, please go ahead and share.
Thank you, Heidi. Yeah, thank you. So the Strategy 2030 operational plan for operational priority 2, accelerating progress in gender equality, specifically refers to the ADB's commitment to integrate transformative gender agenda in our operations. And this is very closely aligned with SDGs and SDG principle, leaving no one behind. So, and this principle requires our developing member countries to address discrimination against them, the disadvantages for women and girls, and also pay specific attention to intersectionalities related to class, ethnicity, indigenous status, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, religion, age, and migration, of course. It also specifically notes that women and girls among the vulnerable and poor households are directly affected by climate change and disaster impacts. They're also more vulnerable to economic shocks, involuntary resettlement, and may require special attention when we design and implement our project. So the operational plan 2 also explicitly mentioned that ADB committed to continue to identify these multiple discriminations and vulnerabilities, and this will be done through the project Poverty, Social and Gender Analysis. While we are talking about the poverty, social and gender analysis, this is where some limitations are coming in several countries, because the project gender mainstreaming work is have to be aligned with the gender mainstreaming guidelines that requires that the gender analysis have to be implemented during the project due diligence, and gender analysis should inform meaningful, measurable, specific and implementable targets that should be included in the project design. So which means that we have to collect data through the gender analysis, identify gaps and issues that will be addressed, collect both qualitative and quantitative data. So we specifically require, for example, baselines. If we are talking, the number of women who benefit from the project, then we have to see how this design will narrow gender gaps. If we are talking about, for example, improving access to infrastructure, we also need to know how many women currently accessing to the infrastructure. We're also working in South Asia department. There is also an initiative that was mostly driven by the developing member countries who wanted to look at more social inclusion part, and this is one of the initiatives that been quite extensively implemented now. So in South Asia Regional Department, we're using not just Gender Action Plan, but the JESI plan, Gender and Social Inclusion Action Plan, which looks both at gender issues, but also social issues. This, as I mentioned, is driven by the openness and willingness of our developing member countries and better legal frameworks on the country level and more openness in terms of data collection. So there are more understanding in terms of, during the project design, there are more understanding on what gaps can be specifically addressed within the project. So what is that exactly we can do? And also the project documents, including Gender Action Plan, is at the end of the project design. These are the projects of our partner organizations, so executive and implementing agencies. So the Gender Action Plan, for example, a JESI plan, have to be fully owned, understood, and there should be strong buy-in for implementation. And this is the most important part, because otherwise, we can design and write all the beautiful measures and actions and targets in it, but it will never be implemented. So in some countries, there is a strong will, and we are supporting our developing member countries in this will. In others, not that strong. And in this case, we are bringing in other resources like a technical assistance to build the capacity, to start the policy dialogue, to have some pilot project to identify the gaps that can help for further investment operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Malika. I would like to call on my colleague Madhu now to come in, and then followed by Bruce, and then by Oliver. And we will keep our answers short because we know that there's more hands raised and more comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. Will try my best to keep it short because there's so many, very good points that have come up. I think one of the key major message that I'm getting is that we should have a separate gender and SOGIESC standard. Before I get into that, I would just like to say how ADB actually operates at the project level. As Bruce had touched upon early in the beginning, that basically we have a proactive agenda for which we are guided by some strategies, policies, or internal operational manuals, as well as we have another agenda which is a do no harm. And do no harm, I would like to clarify, does not mean exclude. It just means do no harm to people who are adversely affected by ADB projects. For example, meaning if people are displaced, if people are, their land is acquired. So I think it's a matter of conceptually how we define the terms and understand the terms both internally in ADB as well as externally. So I just thought I would clarify that point. Now for the proactive agenda, we have a very structured process which starts with an initial poverty social analysis, which considers what kind of impacts, meaning who are the beneficiaries, what is the population group, what kind of benefits, what should be the design of the project, followed by a very intense process of stakeholder consultation, data collection, which assesses the social impacts, the social dimensions, the gender impacts, and also, basically forecast, what kind of adverse impacts can happen related to land acquisition, resettlement, and indigenous peoples. This is then further followed by a detailed poverty social analysis, which tries and figures out how the project design can be improved. It looks into different vulnerable groups. It looks into the intersectionality issues, how different types of vulnerability can put people at risks. So that process, as also Malika explained, results in social development action plans, gender action plans that really covers that issue of access, issue of inclusion that has been mentioned during all the discussion by all the participants and the speakers over here. There's the other parallel stream that works in any project is scoping out what are the adverse impacts on social and environment, which means if you have a population group of 500, maybe 50 are adversely affected. So the safeguards policy applies to those 50 and deals with how to ensure that there is no harm caused. We try to minimize and mitigate, and mitigation plans are prepared. And in this process, there is this issue of scope, screening, scoping, categorization, assessment of vulnerability, and mitigation plans, monitoring requirements, how it will be implemented, resources, all of that is considered, and different documentation is prepared, which are agreed with the borrower and implemented. So these are these two processes, but they actually talk to each other when the project is designed, and you can see those in those documents. Now, how we are trying to address in the new policy? I think the first important thing that we have realized, and especially the issue that we are discussing today, is that whatever may be written in the policy, unless there is a commitment from the borrower, we cannot do anything. We have to get their buy-in. We have to convince them. Now, the issue that we have is very sensitive. So it has to have a very two different approaches in order to address this. And as a practitioner for 20 years in safeguards, I can say that we have to raise awareness of our borrowers on these issues, how our projects can be more inclusive, one stream. Another stream to focus on how we can actually ensure if there are negative impacts, how can we better mitigate them. So what we are planning is in terms of scoping, screening the project, moving towards a more integrated risk assessment, where we would do contextual risk assessment, the kinds of issues that you have mentioned in terms of discrimination that takes place, violence, exploitation, lack of opportunities. One would do that assessment and categorize a project in terms of the borrower's capacity, their legal framework. So all of that analysis that is being discussed today would actually be captured under that integrated risk assessment. Similarly, when you map out the different population groups, you will also look into the different layers of vulnerability and how each and every vulnerability, if they're overlaid on each other. For example, there are people people with diverse SOGIESC issues, lose land and are indigenous. If all of this overlay with each other in terms of vulnerability, it has a different meaning. So there has to be a proper process for stakeholder consultation, identification, and ensuring their voices are heard. Even the mitigation measures, as rightly mentioned by Christina, can be different. It has to be addressed differently. So we are planning that our policy have provisions very specific to SOGIESC issues in the different standards, and so that it is explicitly mentioned. And there are how we will address it. We are still in the process of discussion. We might obviously, now there is an issue that has been raised is why it should be considered as vulnerable. I mean, in a paper, as I said, that our safeguard policy is basically ensuring that no population group are disproportionately affected. So we know that when we have a population group who are adversely affected, there might be people with diverse SOGIESC issues who might be vulnerable. That's the reason in safeguard policies you see that they are placed under the definition of vulnerable groups. I'm not for or against this part, but again, I would raise a question. I see that there has been an ongoing message on that there should be a separate standard. Now, we are also internally discussing in terms of value of having a separate standard. If provisions are already included in the different standards, what value would a separate standard add? I mean, would it make it any different in terms of how we operate? And moreover, if that standard is talking of proactive agenda, our ADB system works very differently. It would be taken care of, but might not be in the safeguard policy. And I think we have to keep in mind, not everything can also be sorted in the safeguard policy. There are a lot of implementation challenges, and I feel we have to have a plan institutionally in terms of how we move forward with the agenda, in terms of a roadmap of awareness building of DMCs, as Malika rightly pointed out, the willingness to work on this topic. At the same time, have adequate provisions in the safeguard policy so that we can follow through implementation. I think I will stop here, and I think there was something on the IP. Yes, when we are talking of including provisions on this issue, we will also look into the interrelationship between IP and SOGIESC issues as well. And FPIC definitely we are considering. I'll stop here. I'm sorry, my response was pretty long.
Thanks, Madhu. Bruce, go ahead. Bruce, please come in.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that so many really important points that are being raised, and in the session, I don't think we'll be able to fully respond to everything today, but just want to pick up on a couple of additional points. There were some really important issues that are raised around the need for us to look at the people that are most affected, and for example, one issue that was raised around intersex people, facing a whole range of economic issues within the broader, more diverse LGBTQI group. So, certainly recognizing not all groups within SOGIESC would be equal, and I think. Sorry, I'll take that back. We want equality, but what I'm trying to say is that we need to give explicit focus in the project and country context for those people that are most vulnerable, most disadvantaged, most impacted, facing the most barriers in terms of inclusion. So I just wanted to recognize that was an important issue. Secondly, appreciated the points raised around differential impacts around disasters, also with respect to risks associated with climate change. There's a range of issues there, and I think this speaks also to a couple of points that have been made throughout the consultation. I mean, clearly, many of you are making recommendations for a separate standard, but also for integration across the standards. And I think that's also something that we recognize there's obviously a lot of intersectionality, and also the need for more integrated environmental and social approach. So, across the standards, from, first standard that's looking at more integrated environmental and social risk assessment and management, through to like labor and working conditions, health and safety, resettlement processes, Indigenous peoples. So, clearly that integration has to be there. But I think the critical issue also for us, which Madhu was speaking to, is, at the end, we need to get an operational framework that we can implement effectively. And I think, others have made this point as well. For example, early on in the conversation with Elaine Zuckerman and Lee Badgett, the need to be able to implement effectively and have integration in more and more projects over time. So, that's another aspect of the conversation that would be important to get to. How to be able to get to an implementation framework. Obviously, engagement with stakeholders, with community on the ground, reaching out to LGBTQI people on the ground in countries in diverse situations is going to be very important. So that's another aspect that we need to recognize. But how to be able to do that under diverse situations, including those where we may have obvious legal barriers, criminality, or perhaps even persecution in some countries. How to go about that in a sensitive way is, I think, something that we have to learn from, and would appreciate further recommendations or thoughts on. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I'd like to invite Oliver now to come in about more on legal barriers and economic analysis.
Yeah,
Oliver, please.
yeah, thanks very much, Heidi. So yeah, on the point about the economic analysis from the EcoSogi report, just for a little bit of information on that, the economic advisors have told us that we need to get to around 50 to 60 countries before we can do the economic correlation analysis. So that will be in the third iteration of that report, which will be led by the World Bank. So we're leading the second iteration. And then after that, there will be some economic analysis coming out of that. Next, I just wanted to quickly pick up on the point of going beyond the legal, which I completely agree with. And just to build on what Bruce was saying, we're looking at doing some country level consultations, as well as within our South Asia department. They've actually piloted a lot of work on intersectionality and looking at multiple vulnerabilities, which I think is really interesting. And certainly in terms of, as you heard from Madhu, making the distinction between the safeguards versus the aspirational development work. There is obviously the option of doing targeted interventions, but I think one additional point to make in terms of a kind of a multiple vulnerabilities approach is that with governments, we potentially would have a lot more license to go a lot further. It is still a very sensitive issue with a lot of governments. So that is just one thing also to bear in mind. Back to you, Heidi.
Thank you, Oliver. We have a few more hands raised. I think we'll go to Julie now. Please, Julie.
Hi, thank you for this conversation. My name is Julie Radomski. I'm a PhD candidate at American University School of International Service, currently writing my dissertation on Chinese infrastructure finance and its social and political implications in developing countries. I also formerly worked at BIC, the Bank Information Center, which is how I got looped into this conversation. I wanted to just very briefly, as I know we're basically out of time, draw attention to the connections between SOGIE issues and disability specifically, and to make the argument that this intersectionality is a vital consideration for the ADB in its safeguards review and in looking at the SOGIE standalone safeguard. LGBTQ persons with disabilities face unique challenges as a result of their disability status, as well as their sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression. Intersectional forms of discrimination and stigma can result in barriers to accessing services like healthcare, an issue which is all the more acute for persons with disabilities, as well as bias and marginalization relating to employment and potentially contributing to poverty. For this reason, the ADB needs to, I would argue, go beyond the do no harm standard in striving for inclusive development in order to ensure that LGBTQ persons with disabilities are able to access project benefits. For persons with disabilities particularly, this entails meaningful stakeholder engagement throughout the project cycle, including accessible consultations that take accommodations into consideration, in addition to employment opportunities and the collection of data relating to disability, as well as SOGIE and gender. If the bank considers disability without attention to the intersections of gender and disability, or sexual orientation and disability, the ADB runs a risk of excluding those who are, for example, both disabled and queer. Meanwhile, attention to those who may be marginalized for both their SOGIESC and disability highlights the need for ADB to adopt a binding standalone gender and SOGIESC safeguard. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I think next we have another hand. Let me see if I can get. Okay, I don't see any other hands raised. Actually. Oh, Joseph. Yes, I see you now. Please, Joseph.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the work that you've been doing, and to all of the great comments from my colleagues during this time. I know we're over time, so that makes me anxious. I will just be, I am the director of the Research Institute at GLSEN. GLSEN is a US-based NGO that works on SOGIESC issues in education. And as the research director, I've for, gosh, many years now, have been sort of documenting the experiences of gender and sexual minority youth and their experiences in school, and have been working with NGOs, over 20 NGOs across the world, including some in East Asia and the Pacific, on really documenting the experiences of LGBTQ plus youth and their experiences with school. And some unfortunate universals that we're finding, although they vary by country and region, but the universal is that gender and sexual minority youth often experience, are really subjected to homophobic, transphobic, gender-biased remarks in school, and also bullying and harassment, victimization, and violence in school that often leads to being pushed out, dropped out, not continuing their education, or being or curtailing their aspirations for further education, which has implications for the quality of their life, economics in the country. And so I applaud the standalone gender SOGIESC safeguard, but I just want to, and I'm happy to see that you have looked at one of the indicators is availability to inclusive education. I just want to speak to one of the most marginalized, vulnerable groups, and really early in their development as humans, is really paying attention to the experiences of youth, in particular as it relates to schools and education. And to build on what Lee Badgett had said about who is this impacting, it's really important to look at that, sort of what is the work and how is it really impacting on the youth population, and what is being built in terms of looking at the accountability of things that are funded in governments, in terms of how are these, how is any of this benefiting perhaps the most vulnerable population. So again, I applaud this effort and really hope that there'll be, and also the importance of really building and partnering with NGOs, as you have identified as one of the recommendations, to access this information and data, because GLISN is working with NGOs across the world, because there is not this information. Governments aren't looking at these issues when it comes to children and youth and education. And it's really important to document these experiences, and sort of, and only in seeing how that tracks over time can we see how these programs are really making a difference in the lives of these young people. So again, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Joseph. We have quite a few comments made in the chat, and there's actually not a lot of time to read all of them out loud, but we acknowledge the comments, and we'll definitely incorporate them into the I think comments that we have been collecting for the consultations. And I'd like to at this point invite my colleague Francesco, who's working in the South Asia region, to come in and share a little bit about some of the ways of incorporating LGBTQ into our operations work. And Francesco's been doing some work in the region and that he can share. Please come in, Francesco.
Thank you very much, Heidi. I'll be brief because most of the people in the audience, at least a few of them, are strong advocates that have been inspiring the work at the World Bank, and even before, from Fabrice to Ellen Zuckerman and Field. So lots of respect for your activity and for your push. Very modestly, I think for the past year in the South Asia Department, we took on the development of a gender equality and social inclusion framework, which does openly and explicitly recognize sexual orientation and gender identity as one of the forms of exclusion and vulnerability that intersect with gender inequality. This admission, against all odds, internally and not externally, has brought us now to basically have a framework with which we can engage with the governments. And I have to say there are some weaknesses. One relates to the Field's question. We need to do better on poverty and social analysis. So whether the ADB does not accept the concept of a standard on safeguard, that's not for me to comment right now. But what I can definitely tell, we can improve the quality of the poverty and social analysis. I have very few examples, only one example in India, where we have distinctively tried to do an in-depth poverty and social analysis with an LGBTQI lens, who brought us to the mobilization of grant resources addressing very few thinking about Miss Bennett's references, very few community, LGBTQ community. It's a very initial process, and I feel very humbled by even saying that. This being said, I think we look forward for your continuous guidance on issues such as the economic cost of discrimination. The entry point I had last week in Bangladesh and in India this week is basically based on data. If you have data and if you take an ADB approach in terms of inaccessibility to services by these vulnerable and excluded groups, there is no one that I met last week in Bangladesh or in India who's not open for discussion and business. So there is some encouraging signs, in my opinion, and we keep thanking you for keeping us as an ADB community alert. We're very humble, we have very little to provide to you, but we do have a framework that can bring us a little bit forward. So thank you very much for inspiring words and for the support in this discussion.
Thank you, Francesco. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to see if anybody who made the comments in the chat would like to speak at all. We are now a little bit over time, but we're willing to stay here and listen some more. Actually, it's very, I learn a lot, and I think it's a very interesting conversation. And if you would like to share some more or raise the points that you made in the chat, please note that we also will record the chat and we'll be reading over them carefully. If you're interested in speaking up now, please let us know. I don't see any more hands raised. And I think quite a few participants have already also left. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Azim to take us to the next part of the discussion. Azim.
Thank you so much, Heidi. And thank you, Oliver Chapman, Dr. Tony Jo Lebos, Madhumita Gupta, Malika Shagozatova, and Bruce Dunn, as well as others I may have unintentionally missed. And of course, those from the events management and SCP teams working tirelessly behind the scenes. But of course, a special and huge thanks to you, our participants and informants, for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of experiences, and the constructive feedback. I'm always amazed that when it's 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. Bruce Dunn's time, we get exceptionally deep comments and active participation. I don't know if there's any corollary there, but it certainly is amazing. I want to reiterate that the comments on the SOGIESC issues in Asia and the Pacific that are received from this consultation and thereafter will of course be considered in the final study report, which will in turn inform the revision of ADB standards and updating of the safeguards policy statement. But please don't go yet. As I mentioned previously on your screen, we'd like your feedback. And we want you to rate or rank this consultation on a score of 1 to 5, 5 being the highest mark you could possibly give it, and 1 being the lowest. This is an anonymous poll, and we're just trying to gauge the overall level of satisfaction by stakeholders and attendees and participants today. So that's all it really is, an opportunity for you to voice your opinion and how effective and satisfied you were by these engagements. It's an opportunity for the ADB to learn from this feedback, and you can provide more specific inputs by going through the menti.com link that was listed in the chat. So menti.com will provide you an opportunity to provide us more specific narrative feedback, but right now what we're most interested in is a quantitative score on how well this particular consultation addressed your needs and how satisfied you were as a result of it. So as you're dwindling in population and attendance, please do that as soon as you can. We'd like to relay the poll results back to you in the next 30 to 40 seconds. There's also a post-event questionnaire, the link to which is also in the chat box. And if you could at some time in the next day or two, go to that. We will send you a reminder email and let us know what your expectations were going into this consultation and whether or not those were fairly, equitably, and reasonably addressed after the consultation or during the consultation. So with that, let me please ask Miel or Jude to provide us the results of the survey. There we go. So 88% have said either somewhat satisfied or highly satisfied, with about 13% ranking us neutral. All of these are very important and interesting to us. And if you would like to provide more specific feedback, we'd love to hear it. And you can do that by going to the menti.com link that's in the chat box now. A reminder that for any of you that may have had or may have still questions or comments or issues or want to share your experiences after this consultation, please use the safeguards update at adb.org email address to send us your comments. For now, I'd like to thank you all for your feedback and overall participation and bring you back to Bruce Dunn of the SDCC to give us a summary of what we've heard from you and walk us through the next steps after this consultation. Bruce, could you please review the discussions and our next steps?
Sure, thank you, Azim, and thank you so much again to everyone that's joined. I apologize that we ran a bit long, and I do know that quite a number of people have had to drop off the call, which is a shame, but it was actually an excellent session. Really learned a lot and appreciated the really in-depth sharing of views that we had from this session. It's going to be very helpful for us as we think about the next steps. Let me try to just very briefly summarize some of the key points that we've heard today, but of course we heard from many people and it was wide ranging, so I apologize that I won't be able to cover all of the key points. I think that the strongest message, clearly coming through today from I think everyone that spoke and also those who put comments in the chat was the recommendation that it's essential for us to have a freestanding safeguard on gender and SOGIESC issues, needs to have explicit consideration and focus in the policy, should be mandatory. And there was also recommendations that the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, is a good model to follow, but also there was some suggestions on areas that maybe needed to go beyond the IDB as well. The recommendations were also not just to have a standalone safeguard, but also to integrate the approach across other standards was recommended, I think, really recognizing intersectionality of issues and the linkage across environmental and social assessment, and then a range of other safeguard standards that would be really important in addition to having a separate standard. Now, clearly, as we heard from a number of speakers, we need to work towards having greater inclusion of LGBTQI people in projects. We've heard the limited progress on that in terms of development projects that really seek to include LGBTQI people. Lee Badgett spoke about some of the review work that's been done that speak to, I think she mentioned about 21 projects in Asia, mostly small scale from civil society. Not so much progress yet with the multilateral development banks. So very much recommending their proactive approach, in addition to looking at the safeguards and the risk management aspects as well. As part of that, we need to look at the people who are most affected and impacted, recognizing that there are differential risks and vulnerability and different country contexts. I think also from our team side, there's a point made there about opportunities to improve poverty and social analysis to support this. Intersectionality, again, I mentioned that briefly, but just to come back to that again, this is clearly critical. Between gender, SOGI and relationships with disability, youth, Indigenous peoples, amongst others, these were all raised today. Another key point was on the need for continuing work on data and supporting that through research. The work that's being done at the moment on legal barriers is certainly supported, but there was a recommendation that this should be coupled with more economic analysis, understanding the economic impacts of discrimination, as well as the social and economic benefits of inclusion. Next, I think a number of people pointed on the issues around gender-based violence and the need to work more comprehensively around integrating sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment risks within the safeguards, and that's a topic that we've just been discussing actually through the consultation process last week. Another issue is around the need for inclusive and accessible stakeholder engagement processes within this process to update to the safeguards, but obviously as part of project design and safeguards processes. More in depth on the ground consultations with community members. As part of the stakeholder process, actually, for the policy update, I think this is also an area where we can do more, and we're having some discussions still within the team on this, but I think we can certainly have some follow-up focus group discussions, as well as in some of the country consultations that we're planning. We can give some explicit focus there. Then turning to ADB and a bit more on the future, beyond the policy, obviously implementation is critical, and we've heard some views on implementation progress from other MDBs, and obviously this is the most critical issue. Needs to be supported by staffing, expertise inside the organization, but of course a strong approach to training, capacity building within our own teams, but also building awareness and support and capacity with our clients and member countries. And I really appreciated, of course, from the participants today, civil society, academic institutions, the great willingness for partnerships and working together, and that's something we certainly support, and would like to very much work with you into the future. So a great range of issues, very important ones that are raised today, and we do take the topic and the consultation and your recommendations very seriously. So we'll be looking carefully at all the details of the consultations today, and then feeding that into the further development of the policy. Just lastly, I mentioned that we are working towards having a draft policy by about September or October this year that we can put out for consultation. So I think that would be a next key milestone. Before that, though, we still do have some further consultations coming up. We're planning still some consultations on the safeguards for different financing modalities and for the private sector. I apologize that we've actually delayed that. We were planning to kick those off next week, but we still need to do some further work on the background study. So we'll be looking to reschedule that most likely in August. So stay tuned for that. We'll also be now moving to the stage of country consultations with 11 countries in the region, which will include consultations with the developing member countries, but also with civil society sessions as well. And that, as I was suggesting before, provides an opportunity for consultations with members of LGBTQI communities in some of those countries. So that's something we need to explore a bit more. So look, I'll wrap up there. Sorry, we've gone a bit long today, but it was an important session and we got a lot out of it, and I hope it was useful for you as well. So thank you again. And until we meet again, stay safe, take care, and thank you again. Bye-bye.